Hello, I'm Baram, and I'm here to talk about the use of heritage in community health. This is a program focused on one particular case study, Newtown in Sarasota, Florida, but hopefully has larger repercussions as a model for understanding how health and history go together. We'll explore issues with the environment, geography, and history to bring out the uses of heritage to make a difference in communities. I'm going to start with a story, then tell another one that makes, I think, a really significant point. I came to Sarasota, Florida in 1997 to start a tenure track position in anthropology at New College, a small liberal arts college. And as I was looking for housing, I drove around the area around the college and saw some interesting possibilities for rent. When I checked with some of my colleagues about the various neighborhoods, they told me to avoid the ghetto. And I was incredibly surprised because I hadn't seen one. It took a little while for me to realize that where I was seeing middle class homes, small houses with yards, driveways, kids' stuff, they were seeing something very different. And the reason they saw something different was because it was the neighborhood of African Americans. Now, that was a quarter century ago. One would think that time has passed, although it's still shocking to hear it in the late 1990s. In 2024, as part of my political activism, I went on a canvass in Newtown to share word about a candidate who I thought would make a really good person on the school board, a nonpartisan position. The person who had organized the event started explaining to myself and the others that it was safe. Now, it was a Saturday morning. It was hot because it was summer, uh, July of 2024. I have no idea where this person sensed that that was a concern, except for one set of issues. The issues were simply the racism that doesn't seem to end. That is, and I wanted to provide a definition for racism so it wasn't just everything, but something very specific. Racism is a worldview and a practice that produces social relations in which some people systematically have less access to resources, power, security, and well-being, while others have much more. And those stories from both my former colleagues and a person who was politically active, and I'll note African American, is the practices that we're referring to, how people talk about places and people and events, created over time through government practices and policies, and reproduced over generations as social practices. Some people just kind of assume these systemic inequalities produce patterns of inequality. Now, racism is not a unique concept around the world. But in the United States, it's the assumption that physical characteristics, obviously mostly skin color, reflect unchangeable inner qualities. And in my training as an anthropologist, my specialty is archaeology. History is a way to confront and negate racism, because one thing that we find from history, things change, people change, societies change. Nothing is unchangeable when it comes to the human condition. So we use history as a way to challenge that basic assumption and hopefully break through those practices and worldviews. Sarasota sits on the west coast of Florida on the Gulf of Mexico, a place of the arts that became popular as a retirement community and has expanded greatly over the last couple of decades, the time that I've been living in this community. And one component of it has been known as Newtown. The term itself started in 1914 when Charles Thompson advertised Newtown Estates. This was an attempt to encourage the African Americans who lived in segregated Overtown of Sarasota, just north of downtown, to find new homes further north of the downtown location. And it kind of stuck as a name. In 2009, the Sarasota City Commission decided to actually define the geography, as you see on the map, into this square. But I've also heard and from one of the elders of the Newtown community, it isn't bounded by those streets. Newtown is a concept. It's a heritage. But wherever there are African Americans in Sarasota, that is Newtown. It's the heritage of Black Sarasota, and that's how I'll be treating it in this presentation. We're looking at history, and any history for what Indigenous people refer to as Turtle Island, what we call America, has a long, long Indigenous history. For Sarasota, it goes back at least 14,000 years, and most likely much longer than that. But it's hard for the people today who come to Sarasota, who live here, who enjoy its maritime environment, to see it, because even near downtown, where there once was multiple mounds, complexes for the indigenous people who'd been there for thousands of years, it's all been erased. The image you see on this slide in the bottom is a road going right through one of the mounds. That is now the major road going north and south, known as the Tamiami Trail, and the mound is gone except for a sign that says Mound Street. I follow the understandings that come from the Seminole tribe of Florida, who looked to one of the great Seminole leaders of the mid-19th century, Wildcat, who talked about how his father referred to the Seminoles having come from the sands of Florida, having come from this very land and of the land. We can look at that history, as you see on this slide, as coming from a long time ago. I tend to use a figure of 20,000 years ago, recognizing the material evidence goes back 14,000 years. And we think about Indigenous history, again, following Indigenous understandings, it will go way past the present. There's other histories here as well. The Spanish came under Ponce de Leon in 1513 and brought Africans with them. And there's an African-American, Black history here as well that is integrated in with the Indigenous and European history, but also has some interesting textures that keep it different, separate, and that difference is something we're going to highlight. The political history has the Spanish here from 1513 to 1763, a brief period where they gave control of Florida to the British after the American Revolution. In 1783, the Spanish returned, although returned weakly, and in 1821 they ultimately handed Florida to the United States, and in 1845 it became the state of Florida, entered the Confederacy, and then returned to the Union, and that's the political entity we have today, the state of Florida. That Black history is one that I want to highlight for understanding Newtown, for understanding the power, inspiration, opportunities of heritage. That what we have across Florida when it was under Spanish rule was a haven for African Americans, people of African heritage, people who had come from Africa, to escape enslavement from the British colonies, to lead a life of freedom and liberty. It's a simple statement, but an important one, that no one wants to be enslaved. And people enslaved in the British colonies, in what's now Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, escaped southward in the hope of finding freedom. And by 1733, they found it at Fort Mose. Earlier in 1693, King Charles, the king of the Spanish Empire, proclaimed that anyone who escaped enslavement in the British colonies, who came to St. Augustine, could live there in freedom if they accepted Catholicism and Spanish rule. And people came. Amazingly courageous people who escaped from enslavement, went through difficult conditions, got to St. Augustine, and by 1733, the Spanish governor created a location just north of St. Augustine known as Fort Mose for these Maroons, these free people of African heritage. That lasted during that first Spanish period. It ended when the British came, but there's another chapter in the heritage of Black freedom on the Gulf Coast that starts with Prospect Bluff, where in Spanish territory, this is the second Spanish period, British soldiers worked with Native Americans and Maroons to build a fort at Prospect Bluff. It's a long, important history that includes American attacks that destroyed Prospect Bluff in 1816. Survivors got to Suwannee, where they were with the Seminole people, and Andrew Jackson came down with his Tennessee volunteers, and in the Battle of Suwannee destroyed that community. Where they ended up, and what we're going to focus on, is Angola, which lasted until 1821, but still lives on, because there are festivals that celebrate this Black freedom, this history and heritage of freedom on the Manatee River in southern Tampa Bay, just north of Sarasota. I could talk for hours about Angola, both the search for it. I was involved in the archaeological search for this community, the partnerships, collaborations that came together so that we were successful in locating material remains of this Maroon community, this community of freedom-seeking people that lasted from 1770s to 1821. What you see in the slide is a digital reconstruction of what Angola might have looked like, with well-made cabins, crops. There were also animals that they had. This was a large-scale community of more than 700 people living in freedom and liberty, deep in Spanish territory, for the sake of their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. An amazing example of the courage and determination that people have to live in freedom. And what is a place that looks like it's just about beaches and retirees and nice restaurants? There's even more going on in this region of what's now Manatee County and Sarasota County. From the 1770s, co-equal with the Angola community, fishermen came from Havana and created what were known as fishing ranchos up and down the west coast. These were communities of fisher folks that included those from Cuba, as well as Native Americans and Maroons. All the discussions of these small little communities that focused on the fish of the bays, estuaries, and Gulf of Mexico noted they were multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, really just dynamic societies that were tremendously wealthy based on the catching, salting, and drying of fish for the Havana market. As we think about this history, that world of freedom-seeking people, the multiplicities found at the fishing ranchos and the connections to Cuba and the larger Spanish world, also had the Seminoles in the center of the state trying to live their lives as autonomous indigenous people, but there were wars thrown against them. The U.S. military refers to the First, Second, and Third Seminole War. The Seminoles refer to the long 19th century war. That Second Seminole War, one of the larger U.S. military engagements of the 19th century, from 1835 to 1842, led to the destruction of many of these communities, led many of the Seminoles on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, destroyed the Maroon communities, and pushed out those fishing ranchos, really started a different type of Florida than had been there for a couple of centuries. That world of the Seminoles, the freedom-seeking people, the Cuban fishermen, ended in the mid-19th century. Florida joined the Confederacy, was defeated during the Civil War, and then in its aftermath, that previous way of life was attacked. It was part of the development of segregation, right? It's a simple truism. People create laws, governments create laws because people are doing things they don't want. And what we see, starting with the railroads, is a divide for travel between two different groups of people, because people are used to doing things together. And its impact was everywhere. In the slide, you see a small little train depot in Venice, just south of Sarasota. And that one beam is there for support of the roof, but also to segregate the train depot into two parts. And this was done throughout. And then it became official after Reconstruction fell apart in the Constitution of Florida in 1885, and marriages were made illegal and schools were separated. this is actually fairly recent in terms of our generations, that a Florida of that multiplicity, of the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religion ended, and a divide was imposed and then reproduced. Even as we get to the doorstep of the 20th century, there's still so few people living in this region. The map from 1897 shows some of the small communities that were up and down the coast, segregated, and part of what led to the world that we know today. As we think about this history, and again, hopefully as a model for understanding histories in other places, we start looking at the different places with, and this is my training as an anthropologist, thinking about them in terms of face-to-face interactions. And so the map takes the city of Sarasota and looks at three different components. One, the downtown region. Second, the Rosemary district, which used to be Overtown, used to be the African-American part of town, and then Newtown, the contemporary African-American part of town. I've done a lot of heritage work in Sarasota, and one of the places I've done work is in cemeteries. It's one of the things that archaeologists always say: if you want to come face to face with the past, go to a cemetery, because people bury their dead with messages, both in the words and symbols they use and the layout. And ultimately, it's about not just the people who are buried, but always oriented to the future. And so we see in the differences in cemeteries issues and concerns concerning social divides, and we see that kind of segregation in the cemeteries of Sarasota. So there's three stories to tell for three different cemeteries. One is the Whitaker Cemetery, which is named for the first white family that came to Sarasota and settled. The graveyard is protected, stewarded by the Daughters of the American Revolution. What's not visible in the slide that shows the mausoleum for the parents is a historic marker that notes this is where the first white child was born in Sarasota. And I'm not going to make more comments on that. When Sarasota was developed into a city in the 1880s, they needed a cemetery, and the Rosemary Cemetery was that cemetery. I was asked almost 25 years ago to help survey the cemetery. There was actually a lot of myths and confusion about the cemetery, because by the mid-20th century, this area around Rosemary Cemetery had become Overtown, the African-American neighborhood, so it was assumed to be the Black Cemetery. In fact, was the White Cemetery that, in doing the research on the cemetery, I learned had been deeded to the city of Sarasota, so I made sure the city officials knew it was their responsibility for this place. The names on the gravestones are some of the major founders of contemporary Sarasota. There's street names that connect to those names. But what's really kind of surprising is at the entrance to the cemetery is two individuals, a couple, who are prominent African Americans. So even in segregated Sarasota, there was an exception made for the Coulsons, for reasons that none of us who do the history of the region can understand or explain. The third, because there was a mortuary apartheid, is the Woodlawn Oakland Cemetery by downtown Sarasota, and where I worked, the Galley Cemetery, the two segregated black cemeteries. And in the work on the Galley Cemetery, we were able to find the really remarkable lives of people who were so important to the history but hadn't entered any of the history books for Sarasota. As we think about those different cemeteries, those different trajectories that were created, well, Sarasota isn't just, it became an important place because it was advertised to be an important place, mostly there for, as the slide shows, for golfing, swimming, boating, fishing, shooting, baseball, tennis, etc., with the sunshine 365 days a year, with the people represented as, well, the founding fathers, the business community wanted. And there also was another Sarasota seen in this ad that Charles Thompson put out in 1914 to create something new, a new town. And that's where we have these two different places developing in the same geographic area, all within the city of Sarasota itself. When we look to the archival record, we find precious little on Black Sarasota. When we do find some hints, they're pretty remarkable. We know from the 1930s, from the WPA Guide to Florida, a sense of the Newtown community. This may have been written by Zora Neale Hurston, who's a famous anthropologist and novelist, and spent a lot of her effort documenting Black Florida. And it describes in a few sentences the community that's there, focused on the circus, which is a big part of Sarasota's history, as well as farming, and really gives a sense of a place. But that sense of place gets derailed. In 1970s, the city of Sarasota wanted to figure out what its history was and took on the task of hiring people to survey the historical resources within the city of Sarasota. But as you read this paragraph, what they did was exclude North Siesta Key. I'm not sure why. There may not have been many people living there, and Newtown. So this was explicit to not tell the history of Newtown. And we wonder where race and racism fits into history. Sometimes it's destruction. Sometimes it's just avoidance. And that's what we find in Sarasota. So that when I came to Sarasota in the late 1990s, trying to learn more about the community, there were lots of books about what we can refer to as white Sarasota and only one on Black Sarasota. It was incredibly unbalanced in terms of the history, and it was kept quite separate. It gets quite worse. In 2011, there was a horrendous murder of 2 British tourists, and the local newspaper, the Sarasota Herald-Tribune, in order to protect tourism in Sarasota, decided to create a byline of Newtown as if it was a different city than Sarasota. So when the story, as it did, went international about these death of these British tourists, it wouldn't be associated with Sarasota itself. As you can imagine, that was not seen as the right move to make. It was recognized for what it was, and to make amends, the same newspaper, the Sarasota Herald-Tribune, made an attempt to tell the history of Newtown a few years later, during that 100th anniversary in 2014, with a series of stories about the people of Black Sarasota, including the ones I mentioned earlier, Lewis and Irene Colson, pictured here with what's assumed to be them, who are buried at the Rosemary Cemetery. Here's where I can make some theoretical points. We're going to go back to history in a moment, but it's always important to recognize heritage isn't just there, that it's a telling or even retelling of history, and heritage initiatives are there for us to know what was in the past. The graphic that I have shows the empirical evidence from archaeological excavations, from archives, books, from memories. That's the stuff of history. The preservation of that history, the remembrance of it, comes, and this is an important piece, effective organized political power. Right? It's not just that people care, that usually happens, people do care, but how to make sure it actually is preserved takes being effective. And when it's effective, then we learn more from the archaeological, archival, oral histories, right? It's a recursive relationship when people organize to care. And the issue is always, why should people care? And I turn to the Seminoles for it. Quentin Cypress from the Big Cypress Reservation has a really important quote that the Seminole Tribe of Florida has put forward. What may look like nothing to you is everything to someone else, right? That there's so much of the past, what gets remembered, where heritage ensures that when people care about something, it is remembered, and hopefully for good, inspiring reasons. And so after giving you a sense of the history of Florida, some of the dynamics for race and racism, and the exclusions, the separations, and the misrepresentations, let's think about this heritage work. And I have on the slides a lot of information, the details, because that empirical evidence is important. I'm just going to breeze through it for you to look at to make the point that we have these cycles. The indigenous history is very long, but things shifted. And they shifted in the mid-19th century. It wasn't with Ponce de Leon. There was centuries of indigenous struggle here, survival. And that's important to keep in mind, that we don't end the story in 1513, but it continues into the 1840s, even 1850s, 60s, 1870s, and continues on today. Modern Sarasota starts really in the 1880s. People come here who envision, who dream of a beautiful community, something that they can enjoy. And it's both European Americans and African Americans who have those dreams and start building and building in the beginning together. In the 20th century, it starts becoming a divide. There's divides in the cemeteries, as I pointed out. There's people have to move in certain places because the geography itself is segregated, and people are having vastly different experiences of living in Sarasota. There's a lot of joy and success. Sarasota grows. It grows tremendously. The county is created out of Manatee County. There's evil marching as well. There are Ku Klux Klan rallies in Tampa and Lakeland, not far away. The Klan has a circus that marches down the main street of Sarasota. There are segregated schools, the Sarasota School, funded by the Rosenwald Fund, because the state won't fund schools for African American students, a hotel for black travelers, right? Everything is getting more and more divided up, and people don't accept it. The National Park Service refers to the Underground Railroad as the first civil rights revolution, and the mid-20th century civil rights struggle as the second civil rights revolution. I usually start, like others, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision that segregation in the schools was not constitutional. Very early on in this struggle, people in Sarasota desegregated the beaches, and it's really a remarkable story. These were individuals. Ed James II made a decision to desegregate the public library. It was a courageous stance, and it occurred. The schools were desegregated, but with struggle, and the African American community forced the issue that their schools were not going to just dissolve, but could be sustained in an integrated environment. So important to learn the lessons of the commonalities that were insisted on to better everyone. Because elections were done at large, the city commission in Sarasota was always only whites. Fred Atkins, who you see in the top right, worked really hard with other activists to sue in federal courts. And they were allowed to have single-member districts, which meant the north part of Sarasota, the African American community, had a chance to elect someone from the community. They elected Fred Atkins, who served until 1995. Others followed in that wake that allowed there to be more voices on the city commission. It's so important to recognize how courageous these individuals were, because they could have been killed for their activism. In fact, we know that one couple, a doctor and his wife, who came down because there were no physicians for the African Americans of Sarasota, came to be a doctor for the black community, and what everyone recognizes was a miscarriage of justice. It was deemed that there was a double suicide. This doctor and his wife lost their lives as they tried to better Sarasota. As we get closer to the present, what had been Overtown, well, there was a push and pull for African Americans to go to Newtown, and it is no longer an African American community. Yes, there's a sign that states it's where the first black community was. It is now the Rosemary District, where there had been shotgun houses and now large-scale condominiums. Heritage occurs because of effective political pressure and activism. As Overtown was disappearing and being replaced by the Rosemary District, there was concern that the same would happen to Newtown itself. Housing prices were going up. There was a worry that this autonomous community, its long-standing traditions, would also be erased, just as the mounds of the indigenous people were erased and the houses and places of Overtown were erased. Vicki Oldham led this activism. The city of Sarasota supported a historic conservation report, and she produced what's known as Newtown Alive, that took the oral histories and put them in print for the first time. From the oral histories, we have a sense of that community, the challenges it faced, and the courage, dignity, and determination of its people. This book becomes a document that has the histories for Newtown, for Black Sarasota. It was more than a book. The conservation study led to Newtown Alive, and Vicki Oldham created signs with images and text put all around Newtown, and created a trolley tour that let people go and hear the stories of those places, usually from either the ones who told the stories or from their children or grandchildren. In 2017, I took some students on that trolley tour, and along with Vicki Oldham, told the story of the various parts of Black Sarasota, including the story at the Wright Bush House. Two of the students were so taken by the history, they asked if they could give back to the community, and what we worked through was they helped paint the house that needed a new coat of paint. And so there is a lot of inspiration that comes from this sort of telling of history that inspires people to give to the community, to care about where they live. One part of that tour takes visitors to Lido Beach and to remember the desegregation of that beach that occurred 70 years ago. There's a joy of remembering and being remembered. In the bottom right is Glossie Atkins, Fred Atkins' mother, who's part of that process, and at 100 years old, being returned to that beach to see the byproduct of what they're able to do, that people can go freely to this beach, but really much more. So we're able to have the civil rights for all. And there's a great amount of significance in remembering this, and realize this is a national event that occurred here in Sarasota. That's not just the local, but these are parts of a larger revolution that was sweeping over, to very good measure, the United States. All these activities were leading to opportunities. At one point, an attempt to create a restaurant named Miss Susie that was created. Now, not everything worked out. This restaurant never opened. So we always have to remember there's struggles. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes not. But the key is the determination to make for a better landscape, a better community, and a better lives for all of us. Just as Quentin Cypress said, sometimes something doesn't look like much to you, but matters to others. As all this activity is occurring, there's a rededication of that marker that was first dedicated in 1985. It was rededicated in 2019 to a great celebration to remember that, yes, the history itself had to be made in terms of the marker and has to be sustained. Again, heritage isn't passive. It comes from people coming together and proclaiming. And what you see is Vicki Oldham and Fred Atkins among hundreds of other people at this rededication event. I've been telling a history as if everyone wants the past to be remembered. Across the country, the Equal Justice Initiative has been ensuring that the era of lynchings from the late 19th into the mid-20th century are remembered. There was a movement to remember those lynched in this region. The interest was there, but the marker ultimately was not placed in Newtown, wasn't placed in the Rosemary District in Overtown, not downtown, but outside of town. And the Unitarian Universalist Church is the one that gave land for their remembrance. That remembering is important. Where the remembering happens also is significant. And know there's lots of debates in every community about what should be remembered and how should it be remembered. All this energy from all this heritage work has led the leaders of the Sarasota African American Cultural Coalition to decide to have a museum and cultural center. The first step is a small building known as the Leonard Read House, Leonard Read being one of the first African Americans in Sarasota in the beginning of the 20th century. His two daughters were school teachers, so the name is very well known. And this cultural center that's planned will be a place for learning, for study and hope it inspire continuing work on this important history for Black Sarasota and Black Florida and frankly civil rights across the United States. And now let's start. We need this because there are so many challenges. The legacies of segregation, of slavery, of racism are still with us today. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I joined with the Multicultural Health Institute to figure out how do we inform, educate, share information in the Black community, the Hispanic community, and other marginalized groups about what's going on with COVID, how to overcome the distrust that is rightfully there. And so this was one of the ways to talk about history, to make sure that people recognize why we had the divides and hopefully working together to overcome them for the health of everyone. Environmental racism is a term used for the reasons there are toxins in African American neighborhoods as well as indigenous and other communities, marginalized communities, groups. In Sarasota, the Marian Anderson Place is a brown field where toxins still leak out. Throughout Newtown, there are also multiple concrete recycling plants, some near the schools, that cause health impacts. And we need to think hard about why they're there, what we can do to end it, and to ensure that there's a healthier place. The environment matters, and the racialized geography is part of the environmental set of concerns. We are learning so much about what's happening as the climate is changing. Our summers are getting hotter. And in the spring of 2024, NASA came out with a study of Sarasota County looking at urban heat islands. And Newtown tends to have a greater heat vulnerability than other parts of Sarasota County. Again, a legacy of the type of housing, streets, lack of trees that we find in that northern Sarasota community. Issues that can and need to be addressed for the sake of people's health. Sarasota grew as a coastal community, and while Newtown isn't on the coast, when we look on the maps, we see that Newtown is in a basin that when, and it's a when, not if, floods come through because of hurricanes and other storms, there's a greater danger for the residents of Newtown than in some of the nearby areas that are on slightly larger ground. One of the ways I've approached this in my own work, and I know others have done this as well, is to listen to the elders, the people who remember where there were swimming holes and streams and previous flooding, because one of the truisms about water is it always comes back. And so if we can identify the wheres and their specificities, then we can work on addressing and saving people's lives and property. Newtown is not unique. There's larger issues throughout the region, both that focus on what's remembered in museums and festivals and what is preserved. And we can and should integrate this history for African Florida and African American Florida into the history of Florida so people can appreciate all the dimensions of heritage for this region for the greater good. You've been patient as I've gone through these issues surrounding heritage, surrounding history, surrounding Newtown and African American history and racism and its legacies. To conclude, I'm trained in archaeology, so I always believe in digging deeper. We understand health disparities, environmental concerns, the disconnect among various places. Let's dig deeper. Let's address those social concerns by approaching issues of oppression and racism, injustice, poverty, trauma, inequalities. When we do that, when we bring them up, hopefully it provides both inspiration, but also more information. Now we know much has been erased, but the work of scholars and community members mean much is being recovered. I'll just end with one of my favorite proverbs. A tree with strong roots laughs at storms. We know there's going to be more challenges from the climate, political and economic challenges, but a sense of being grounded in a place, knowing the entire history in all its complexities, means communities can be stronger. And I hope you join in making sure that heritage stays alive for Newtown, for Sarasota, for Florida, for the United States, and elsewhere for the sake of our communities. Thank you so much for listening to all this. I'm Baram. Goodbye.